Thank you very much. I'm not sure how much I can offer in the way of digesting these three very rich papers, which I heard like you for the first time now. But I did want to take the opportunity to think, to flip the question of the conference slightly and ask what might Middle East and North Africa learn from Africa? What impact might it make? Very similar to the way Shamil was putting forward some ideas. What could we learn? And then I also, being a feminist political activist, couldn't resist taking the moment to point to some important questions around gender, women's rights, and sexual orientation. So let me first begin by agreeing with Professor Shaabi that transitions are periods of great uncertainty. But we also know from particularly the feminist literature on transitions that they also offer moments of great opportunity if you are able to gather your forces at crucial moments. And what we can learn, for example, from failures in earlier transitions to democracy in Africa, and the success, relative success of a later transition in South Africa is the importance of having a place at the table. Who is it that is shaping what this new society is going to look at and what it's going to look like? Now, clearly in this conference and in the discussions about the region, more generally, the question of where women fit into this process have been marginalized, put to the side. I was slightly disappointed that after all this time, we haven't learned the importance of putting the gender question up front here in the Middle East itself and in the North African revolutions or transitions, whatever we want to call them. Indeed, there is quite a lot of discussion on the sidelines of what the implications of this will be for women. There are no resolved, I would say, positions as yet. Huge debates between, for example, people who understand, feminists who understand democracy as equality, and women who want to think much more about difference. And I think there's going to be some very interesting and path-breaking work emerging from that angle. But I think for this conference itself and for the conversation more broadly, we really do need to think about what we understand by the post-authoritarian state in the region. What we can learn from the South African example and other African examples is that very quickly women's rights will be seen as demands for representation, that is, demands for having a set number of women in parliaments or in elected and nominated bodies. What we also know is that that is not going to be enough, that is in fact not necessarily going to be advancing women having a voice, an effective voice in the politics that will shape their lives and in policy making. So the issue of inclusion to me has to go beyond the issue of representation. It has to go beyond the issue of dress and headscarves, as was so eloquently pointed out. This is a question that is much more at the heart of how we think about the relationship between personal law and the state. It is the relationship between, for example, how we decide what mechanisms of justice are going to be in place, who will be making decisions about areas of family and personal law. Are those decisions going to be made in ways that are derived from principles that recognize the personhood of women, that recognize the dignity of women, and perhaps also that recognize the equality of women? So in deciding on whether these states are to be secular or not, I think what that discussion may at this point not be taking account of is the very real impact of that for women in particular. I was very glad that the issue of difference in other ways, religious difference, sexual difference, was raised, because I think that too is an area where we would, to learn from other transitions, we would be making a big mistake to defer those questions to a future period. If we do that, we will be making, not making the most of the opportunity that is offered by transition. In South Africa, for example, it was very important that the constitutional deliberations included the clause on equality. Had we not had the clause on equality, more recent populist directions, populist culturalist directions that are being taken by some forces in our political system would have led to a very easy adoption of legislation that is problematic, that would be problematic in particular for rural women. So it's really, seems to me, one thing we can learn from other transitions is that if you don't put down on paper what your bottom line is, you will lose that opportunity, and then the particular range of forces that may or may not be favorable to the recognition of women's rights will take their place. So the 2 points that I want to make is firstly about representation as not being the route for recognition, or not solely the route for recognition for women, religious minorities, and sexual orientations other than the heterosexist norm, that we cannot rely on existing leaders. We never can, and this is not a statement about the particular political leaders in the Middle East and North African revolutions, but in general, we cannot rely on political leaders to define who the revolutionary subject is, because as it's been pointed out, at the moment, the revolutionary subject appears to be heterosexual male practicing Muslims. So I want to ask, who is the revolutionary subject in a more open way, and what does that mean for the future? Now, it may be that in the debates about culture and rights in the Middle East now, we have the opportunity to deal with some very thorny and unresolved issues about equality, culture, and difference that I think we haven't really dealt with in the South African case. So from that point of view, I'm very interested in what Arab feminists are beginning to articulate as a new way forward in relation to how we see public and private, how society is divided. We hear looking at societies in which the public sphere is very small, in which relationships of reciprocity are very much based on private sector and family contributions rather than looking to the state. So it seems to me we don't have models in thinking about democracy at the moment that would address that for women. So we have models of Nordic democracy, we have models of socialist democracy, neither of which speak to the question of the relationship between public and private in ways that are meaningful to the Middle East and North Africa, and some parts of Southern Africa as well. So I just put those questions there as things that I think we need to think about. I am hopeful that despite the fact that there are no specific papers on gender, that this will become, and on sexual orientation, that these issues will continue to be raised within the conference, because it really troubles me that we might be reproducing the kinds of silences and absences in earlier transitions, and missing what was the central lesson, I think, for South African women, which is that if you don't shout, push, bang down the door right at the beginning, you are not going to be taken seriously. Thank you.
As a social scientist, as a political scientist, the early comments and the late comments as well brought me to think about this sort of the superimposition of language and of terms and of categories we use from one reality to the next. I think Hushang made a very important point initially about this type of borrowing, of this type of sort of inclusion in the language. And that relates also to your last comments as a discussant. Because we have dealt with, as scholars of transitions to democracy, with lots of issues related to the breakdown of authoritarian regime and the move toward democracy. This was the issue that was at stake, with or without the question of the legitimacy of borders of states. Sometimes it was with the breakdown of states, sometimes it was without, as in the case of South Africa or many other cases. And we were trying, right, to draw sort of like parallels between this kind of transition, making classification, as Garth was trying to make, between types of regime, how they lead, what types of results. And I think what we have to be very careful is to see to what extent we can really burrow this into the reality of the Middle East for particular reasons. One is what you said, Hushang, is about last night's comments, about the very essence of transitions that they are related to states to begin with. Regime transitions are related to states. If there is failed states, if states are not controlled, if the very essence, as Juan Lintz, our colleague and Stepa made, this is the prima facie, this is the quintessential question. Do we have stable states? And if they are stable, to what extent regime can change? Egypt is a very good case. We will wait, we will see. Second, when we have a regime transition, when we talk about democracy, what do we mean by that? Is it transition to another regime and may have manifestation of Schumpeterian democracy, which we don't know yet, free and fair election, regular interval, the minimum definition that one uphold as an essence? Or do we talk about the sets of certain values that want to be enshrined, that Hushang were talking about, you talking about, or Garth were talking about in his comments, less so in the sense of like the paradigm of what you were talking about, modernization and imperialism and so on. I think we are here, it's a bit confusing to me, because what we have seen in the Middle East right now is an avalanche of thoughts. We tend to confuse the streets with democracy. We tend to confuse popular uprising with democracy, because the people are speaking in their mind. Democracy is about regimes, is about the arrangement of political life with certain institutions that merit this term democracy eventually. And I think this is something that needs to be addressed in this conference, because we are certainly witnessing transformations. But transformation is a big word. We are constantly witnessing transformation. As you suggested, we may look at all of this as a transformation since 1848. Last night I heard we are in a 100 years transformation. You know, the old story about Mao Zedong, when they came to Mao and asked him, what do you think about the French Revolution? He said, it's too early to tell. So maybe it's too early to tell, but this doesn't help us in understanding and grappling with this question, which is so immense. We're in the midst of one of the greatest, bloodiest events right now unfolding in Syria. I don't know if you know, but in Syria, at this moment, more people have been killed in the last 18 months than the entire conflict in the Middle East in 64 years. I looked at the data. It's amazing. Now, these are events, and we put them in the same kind of like bucket. I think this is, in this panel in particular, which set the stage for some theoretical clarity, I think Hushang's words in particular are very important to be heeded, because we are oftentimes superimposed terminology and the last comments on feminism and so on, issues that are completely absent in the current discussion in the Middle East. They're irrelevant. They're irrelevant. They're kind of like, and it's not they're irrelevant issues, but irrelevant to the discourse.
Thank you very much. I think that what stood out for all three speakers was the issue of democracy. And the question that raises to mind really is, when you consider the uprisings, the revolt, the events in the Middle East, really, what was the purpose of these events really for the establishment of democracy? We've seen different evocations of democracy in all three speakers' lectures. I think for Hushang, democracy emerges as the sublime ideal that the natives have not yet adequately grasped. You know, for him it seems to be like making a transition from being Iranian to American is like reaching the end of history. This is the kind of democracy that is bereaved of all kind of context. You know, the kind of democracy that emerges is, after all, a European phenomenon. There seems to be some kind of conceptual dependency when this is put out as a model to which the rest of us have to now, you know, aspire towards. I just want some clarity on that. You make a difference between majoritarianism and democracy. Garth, on the other hand, gives us a little bit of a stretched out reflection on democracy and the waves in which it has come to us. And Shamil then finally reminds us that, you know, there are other analogues, but they all seem to have some kind of a assumption about the fact that we are moving towards democracy. I just want to put that entire thing under question.
Okay, thank you. My name is Ahmed Abdurabu, Assistant Professor of Comparative Politics, Cairo University. I just like the point pointed out by Professor Shihabi when he said that democracies don't really guarantee rights of minorities, which is very true in my point of view. And I think since Arab revolutions or uprisings, we've discussed so many matters, so many questions of democracy, of, for example, Islamists and so on. However, one very marginalized point here is to what extent Arab revolutions will bring rights to minorities. In Egypt, for example, I have the concern that 3 categories of people are being marginalized: Christians, women, and youth. And since we had our parliamentary elections and our presidential elections, you can imagine that out of 508 members of the parliament, now the parliament is dissolved, but when it was there, we had only 2 elected Christians out of 10% of the whole population. Finally, they became 8, but they became 8 because the president at that time was the military council, had the right to appoint 10. So he was trying to balance the situation. Out of 508 members of the parliament, we had only 3 or 4 women. Again, 2 of them were appointed by the military council, only 2 directly elected by the people. Same for Christians, same for youth. Out of 13 official candidates for the presidency, we had no youth, we had no Christian, we had no women. So my question to you, if you may elaborate more on this, what type of democracy do we need after uprisings? Is it the general democracy, the Western democracy? Is it the representative democracy? I mean, I think we need to tackle more this point in more detail. Thank you very much.
My question is for Garth. I heard with a great deal of interest your various definition and the manner in which you describe the various models of regimes and the corresponding characteristics. Now, this may be asking for too much. Just as someone who has an in-depth study of psychology ends up being confused about his own personality because he begins to see symptoms of psychosis and neurosis. I was wondering, what would your political diagnosis and prognosis be of the current South African regime? You spoke about neo-patronial regimes, plebiscitary regimes, etc. And I don't know if I should say this, but you begin to see characteristics appearing. You spoke about patronage, and then you spoke about dynastic regimes. We also have very huge political dynasties in our country. So I was wondering what your political diagnosis and prognosis would be. Thank you.
Okay, on the issue of Iran becoming like America, well, I've lived in both countries. I'm a citizen of both countries, and I have a very clear preference. So that is so much for that. As for the model, No, in the United States, it took us 150 years after the end of slavery to elect a black president. If Mitt Romney is elected, it'll be over 100 years after the Prophet Joseph Smith was murdered by a religiously inspired mob for us to have a Mormon president, which might be the only good thing about that. I think I made it quite clear that my sympathies are much more with India. I would be very happy for Iran to become more like India. That's all I can say.
I hear what Professor Sheikh is saying, but however you deconstruct, the language of transition, I think we have to accept, Yossi, that in the broad literature of revolutions and revolutionary change, that structural characteristics, whether you read Barrington Moore or whether you read these are very important. You need to understand what will drive the change. And I think this is essentially, where I come out in terms of looking at the broad structural, and I'm not saying that the themes that I have identified would be the key drivers. But in my assessment, in terms of as far as the terms of reference are concerned, I think they will have a determining influence. Of course, there's a dialectical interplay between these and how these will play out across a very volatile, turbulent, and fast-changing terrain is another matter. But the fact that, the pace of transition remains indeterminate, how you construct the language of that transition, who the actors are that will shape the general discourse, I think you're dealing with a very sort of fluid, open, and contingent environment. So, as social scientists, we take complex realities and then we boil it down to an essence and we say, these are maybe the causal variables that we need to understand. The language of transition and how it's playing itself out, I think is a matter for another kind of inquiry. So you put me on the spot, and I will nail my colors to the mast since this is a public platform. But I think, we do face the specter in South Africa under the ANC, where all these morbid symptoms, I think we are in a kind of Gramscian moment, Antonio Gramsci. He talked about the old is dying and the new cannot be born, and then in the interregnum you deal with a whole lot of morbid symptoms. Now it seems to me the morbid symptoms are becoming much more prominent and prevalent as we try and address some of the very basic issues in our social contract relating to poverty, inequality, and unemployment. And then that has to do very much with the kind of custodial role that the ANC has in the society. As a party that in many ways, in my view, has lost its moral compass and legitimacy to govern. And you can see the symptoms of that in terms of the misrule, misgovernance, the misappropriation of resources. I mean, the ANC has power, but in my view, it doesn't know how to govern. Full stop.
Thank you. In the great literatures on revolution, one of the things that I certainly neglected was interstate relations. And Skocpol in States and Social Revolutions made this point very clearly. And when I was reading that in the 80s, that wasn't really significant for us at the time, interstate relations. She was looking at revolutions, their consequences, and interstate as well as intrastate relations. I was just thinking for the democracy theorists, I mean, what is the impact of your neighbors? I mean, if you look at South Asia, the impact of India as a model of democracy on Pakistan, in Southern Africa, you have all sorts of regional blocs and emerging, apart from the AU, and as Garth had said, or Shahabi had said, people get expelled if they turn to military dictatorships. I think this is the kind of thing that can be taken into account insofar as regional fora and future development of Arab and Middle Eastern regional organizations go with regard to minimal levels of democracy and encouragements. I mean, especially in this kind of interconnected world we are in. That's all I
I don't have much to add except to say it's easy to figure out what we're against. It's a different task altogether to find language to articulate what we are for. And it seems to me we can't postpone the question of, or the discussion of what we are for until we think we have state power, right? So that's really the point I want to make. We have to start developing the languages, the concepts, to understand now what it is we want to put in place. And that has, one of the questions then that we have to confront is the relationship between state and society.
Thank you. I was very pleased that Shamil Jaffe made reference to the Nile Delta strikes of the textile workers in Egypt. Until then, given last night's very interesting keynote speech, I was worried that the role in Tunisia, for sure, in Egypt, but definitely of organized workers was going to be left out. Indeed, the trade unions in Egypt and Tunisia have played a very important role. And we haven't heard the last of them. Shamil, I also found the references to South Africa and the turning point with Portuguese colonial collapse very useful. However, I'd like to just remind you that to 74 and the Portuguese collapse, which played itself out so well in our part of the world, were the big strikes, first in Namibia in 71, and then in South Africa in 72, which again brings us to the point of the role, obviously, of organized labor and of the masses, of the people. And let me just then add, in relation to transition, the role of people in transition and of class forces, gender elements, the middle class, counter-revolution, etc. Relevant to South Africa, I'll just end here because I don't want to speak too long, but in keeping with some of the Marxist statements, a fellow called Lenin, talking about the outcome of national liberation struggles, the outcome very much we can refer to what's happening in the Middle East, that the character of the outcome will depend on the strength of the various class forces. And in relation to socialism, I'm not suggesting anything of that nature in the Middle East at present, but certainly in South Africa, that would very much be the question of the role of organized labor. And I think we should think in that sense, in relation to Tunisia and Egypt, of course, where there are important class forces, what that outcome can be. It's not just about the military or middle classes or counter-revolution or even the most popular groups there, the Muslim Brotherhood. The problem, of course, of Syria and elsewhere is that there's such an impasse and there's military might against military might. And that's where the big danger lies. Metternich's Europe again, Shamil, of counter-revolutionary elements being brought in from abroad to settle accounts. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is John Daniel. I'm a political scientist from South Africa. I want to pick up on a comment that Shireen made when at the beginning of her presentation she talked about transitions as particular moments of great uncertainty and of opportunity, and I would also add of great violence often. And we should not forget, when we consider the miracle of our transition, that in the 4 years it took to negotiate the new arrangement, nearly 10,000 people died in the province of KwaZulu-Natal alone in a vicious civil war between ANC-aligned forces and forces aligned to a conservative ethno-nationalist group known as Inkatha. But let me pick up on the term, on the concept of opportunity. I think the greatest triumph of the South African tradition was not the extension of the franchise or the election of a legitimate parliament, but the Constitution. The 1996 Constitution and the fact that that Constitution was made sovereign in the new political dispensation.
And what that constitution is an extraordinary document. It has 27 entrenched rights, a broad range of social, economic, and political rights. And it was imposed on basically a conservative polity and a conservative citizenry. It represents an opportunity taken by a very skillful bunch, the ANC Constitutional Committee, brilliant lawyers who slid through this constitution, which consolidates rights which most South Africans do not in fact support. Most South Africans would like to bring back the death penalty. Most South Africans oppose abortion. Most South Africans are homophobic. And yet we have this extraordinary document that outlaws discrimination and protects all of those rights. And that, Garth, that is the custodian of our transition, that document, that constitution. And the great lesson, I think, to be learned by other transition societies is what is in the new constitution. That is the key. I mean, I think it's extraordinary that it's taken nearly 15 years for the sovereignty of our constitution to be questioned. And what is alarming is that that question should be raised by our president, which I think is enough reason to get rid of him. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ron Greenstein from Wits University in Johannesburg. I just want to make a point about analogies and comparisons, which I think are useful, and the analogy of the Southern African region is useful, but up to a point. Because when we use analogies, we have a tendency to superimpose them on reality and then look for specific events, specific personalities, specific regimes, which fit our preconceived notion of transition or transformation. And I'm speaking specifically about the notion that the Southern African region is an analogy for what's happening in the Middle East and North Africa today. And we can I think there are important lessons, but we shouldn't get carried away. For example, just in brought up by the presentation by Shamil Japi, Mubarak is not Banda. Banda was a minor politician. When he passed away, it barely made the newspapers, a headline in South Africa. When the current president of Malawi died a couple of weeks ago, I think, most people in South Africa are not even aware of it. When Mubarak falls, it's a major, not just regional, but international event. So when we carry out this kind of comparison, let's look also at the question of scale. South Africa was a regional giant. The South African economy was bigger than all the rest of the region combined. And it affected profoundly the nature of all Southern African economies. There's no equivalent to that in the Middle East. Israel is definitely not the equivalent of South Africa in this sense, because its economic role in the Middle East is very marginal. If we look at cross-border incursions, they were central to political transition in Mozambique. The South African incursions in Mozambique and Angola, they shaped entirely the nature of political conflict. Israeli incursions may be important in Lebanon, but are completely marginal to Egypt and the rest of the Arab world. So I think the analogy is interesting, but we should keep it within limits and focus on the centrality of one superpower in the Southern African region, whereas the Middle East is much more diverse with many different power centers. Egypt is a central political actor, but is not a central economic actor. The Saudi regime is central economically in certain respect, but is not so important politically, and so on and so forth.
Ultimately, what we are talking about is how relations between states and societies will be recalibrated in these countries. How do you manage this very tense dialectic that is unfolding in a way that moves these societies to sort of the classical Hegelian juncture, where the private and the public realm enjoy relative autonomy from each other? In other words, to move these countries away from what Larbi Sadiki has called the democracy of the bread, where the public realm totally dominates the private realm, and there's this kind of vertical dependence. So for me, very much, it is in the tension between relations between states and societies and how these evolve in terms of this classical distinction between the public and the private realm, that will determine, very much in my view, the transition dynamics and chemistry.
Yeah, thanks for the comments on analogies and comparisons. They're always complicated, and we shouldn't, we should just use them as thought experiments and then abandon them and go on to other possibilities. So those are interesting details. You know, I think the thing we often forget is that at the origins of these uprisings, in terms of organized formations, was a group called the 6th movement of young people. What has been, in Egypt at least, what has been focused on in their activity has been the use of Facebook. What doesn't get said regularly and often enough is that they got together to organize and to organize middle-class youth and conscientious youth around the fact that there was no minimum wage in Egypt. And that's where it started off. And so the complete neglect of the labor movement, in fact, the antipathy of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Justice and Freedom Party to the labor movement is just very worrying. And it's going to put a tremendous sort of damper on this kind of origins that happened around the question of a minimum wage and workers' rights and recognition of the labor movement and so on. So it's a pity we don't have any of their representatives here. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much to the speakers and Shireen as discussant for a really productive and constructive opening session.